Carla was the daughter of the second family, a quiet reminder of a past divorce and a new beginning. In the sprawling Davenport mansion, that status was a sin she could never wash away. She and her full brother Liam grew up in the long, cold shadow of their father's first family. Her father was Richard Davenport, the titan behind the legendary fashion house Davenport Industries. He was a man who could command boardrooms and conquer markets, but was a stranger in his own home, his time consumed by the empire he had built. Carla's world was small, safe only within the protective circle of her brother Liam and in the pages of her sketchbook. She had a secret weapon, a gift for design, a talent for seeing the beauty in the architecture and fabric. It was a spark from her father's own fire. On the rare occasions Richard saw her designs, his distant eyes would light up with a flash of genuine pride. But that pride, meant to be a gift, was a curse. Eleanor, Richard's formidable ex-wife, saw this. She looked at Carla not as a child, but as a threat. A threat to the inheritance, the legacy, and the power she believed belonged solely to her sons, Mason and Blake. And so the quiet war began. It was fought in whispers in the hallways, in condescending remarks at the dinner table, and in the cruel pranks Mason and Blake played on Carla. Every time, Liam would step in front of her, taking the blame, shielding her from the worst of it. The bond between them was the only warmth in the freezing opulence of the mansion. They lived on a fault line, a fragile piece ready to shatter with the slightest tremor. They were about to learn that in the world of the obscenely rich, love is a liability ... and betrayal is just business. The tremor was coming. Asterisk Richard Davenport, the titan, was gone. A sudden, massive heart attack on a business trip to Milan. The news broke like a thunderclap, a headline that screamed from every financial news channel. In the ensuing chaos, Eleanor, the ex-wife, moved with a chilling, predatory purpose. The funeral was a grand, cold affair, a masterclass in public performance. Eleanor, draped in designer black, played the part of the grieving matriarch, even as her eyes held a glint of triumph. Carla and her mother stood off to the side, invisible in their real, unperformable grief. The real execution, however, took place a week later, in the sterile environment of a lawyer's office. Carla, Liam, and their mother were summoned for the reading of the will. Eleanor was already there, seated beside her sons, a picture of calm authority. The family lawyer, a man with eyes as cold as his leather briefcase, read the document. It was a dagger wrapped in legal jargon. A last-minute amendment, he claimed, signed just weeks before Richard's death. His voice droned on, but the words were sharp, each one a separate cut. Davenport Industries, the mansion, the offshore accounts. The entire fortune was to be placed into a trust managed by Eleanor for the sole benefit of her sons, Mason and Blake, and for Carla, Liam, and their mother. Nothing, not a single share, not a single dollar, not even a mention. They were written out of Richard Davenport's final story. As if they had never existed, Liam erupted, his voice raw with disbelief, shouting that it was a fraud, a lie. But Carla was silent, frozen. She watched her mother, a woman already made fragile by illness, seem to shrink in her chair. The color drained from her face. That legal document hadn't just stolen their inheritance. It had stolen the very breath from her mother's lungs. The betrayal was absolute. Eleanor and her sons had won the first, most decisive battle. They had the money, the power, and a piece of paper that made their cruelty the law. For Carla and her family, the gilded cage had just become a debtor's prison, and the walls were closing in, fast. Asterisk, she faded quietly, like a photograph left in the sun. There were no dramatic last words, no final tearful speeches. Just a weary closing of the eyes in a small, rented apartment they could barely afford. a world away from the mansion she once called home. Carla and Liam were now truly orphans, and just as Carla buried her mother, her last pillar of support was ripped away. Liam's military unit was being deployed. Emergency orders, no delays. 2 weeks. Their goodbye at the airport was a frantic, whispered promise to reunite and fight back, but it felt like a final farewell. As the plane took off, Carla had never felt so alone. With Liam gone, she was a ghost haunting her own life, and Eleanor was the exorcist. The cruelty, once veiled, was now direct. It wasn't physical violence, it was worse. It was the accidental encounters in public where Mason and Blake would mock her secondhand clothes. It was the phone calls from anonymous numbers whispering how her mother died worthless. It was the calculated psychological warfare designed to dismantle her piece by piece. They wanted to erase her, to break her so completely that she would never have the strength to fight back. One rainy night, sitting in the soul-crushing silence of her tiny room, Carla knew she had 2 choices: let the grief swallow her whole, or just disappear. She packed a single bag. Inside, she placed her mother's worn scarf, her father's old fountain pen, and her sketchbook full of designs, the only true inheritance she had left. She walked out into the storm, not with a plan, but with a single burning instinct: survive. She bought a one-way bus ticket to a city she'd only seen on a map. She had to become someone else, or she would become nothing at all. The longest night of her life wasn't the night her father died, or the night she buried her mother. It was this night on a bus to nowhere, with nothing but ghosts in the seat beside her. She had escaped the prison. But now, she was an exile in a world that didn't know her name. Asterisk 2 years. For 2 years, Liam served his country in Dusty. Foreign lands, his sister's tear-streaked face, the last image he held on to. He returned a decorated soldier, harder, sharper, and more focused, with a single mission burning in his mind: find Carla and begin their war. Part 4. Vows in the ashes. He returned to a cold, empty apartment and a disconnected phone number. She was gone, vanished. For weeks that felt like months, Liam searched, his soldier's discipline warring with a rising tide of panic. He called every old friend, every distant acquaintance, chasing down whispers and rumors that led nowhere. It was as if she had walked off the face of the earth. Finally, a breakthrough. A former neighbor recalled a detail of a late-night conversation, a mention of a bus ticket to Chicago. It was a sliver of a lead, but it was all he had. He found her. In the city's garment district, a gray world of clattering machines and weary faces. And for a moment, he didn't recognize her. The girl hunched over a sewing machine in a noisy factory wasn't his sister. This woman was thinner, her eyes holding a tired caution. But her hands still moved with the impossible grace of an artist. He took a breath and said her name, a word he hadn't spoken aloud in 2 years. Carla. Her head snapped up. The world of noise and threat and deadlines fell away. The reunion wasn't loud. It was a silent, desperate embrace, a collision of 2 broken people who were only whole when they were together. That night, in her tiny, threadbare apartment, the full story came out. Every cruel word from Mason, every mocking laugh from Blake, every crushing blow from Eleanor. As Liam listened, the brother's rage burned away the soldier's calm. He saw her sketchbook hidden under her bed, filled with breathtaking designs, a genius hidden away in the dark. He looked at her, his voice low and steady. They didn't just take our money, Carla. They took our mother. They took 2 years of your life. The running stops. Now, he opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. This, he said, his finger tapping the empty sheet. This is our weapon, your talent, my discipline. We start here from nothing. We build an empire from the ashes, and we will not stop until we watch theirs burn to the ground. In the heart of that forgotten apartment, a vow was made, a promise sealed in grief and forged in the fire of revenge. The exiles were finally coming home. Their first headquarters was the cramped Chicago apartment. The living room became a design studio, littered with sketches and fabric swatches. The bedroom was a warehouse, stacked with boxes. The kitchen table was the boardroom where they planned their attack on the fashion world. CARLA designed, sketched, and sewed, her fingers often raw, pouring all her pain, her hope, and her fire into every single stitch. Liam, the disciplined soldier, became a one-man army of business. He built the website, taught himself marketing, negotiated with suppliers, and packed every single order himself late into the night. Their philosophy was simple: be everything. Davenport Industries was not Davenport sold quiet luxury, tradition, clothes for the established 1%. Amaryllis sold rebellion. CARLA's designs were bold, architectural, and fiercely alive. They weren't clothes for fitting in. They were armor for standing out. They launched online. At first, a trickle of orders. Then a fashion blogger in New York City discovered them. A single post titled "The Future of Fashion is Blooming in Chicago" went viral. The trickle became a flood. Their first small collection sold out in under a week. They poured every dollar of profit back into the business, moving from the apartment to a small, gritty studio in the meatpacking district. They hired their first intern, and then came the call that changed everything, an invitation to New York Fashion Week. It wasn't the main stage, but a coveted spot in the emerging designers showcase. It was their shot dot as their final piece, a stunning black coat with a collar that bloomed like a night flower, walked the runway to a storm of unexpected applause. CARLA and Liam stood backstage, breathless. They were no longer ghosts, they were a brand, a force. They had lit a small fire, bright enough to warm themselves by. What they didn't realize was that back in the cold marble halls of Davenport Industries, their flame was now big enough to be seen. And some people make it their business to extinguish any fire they didn't start. Asterisk in a cold, glass-walled office overlooking the city, Eleanor met with her sons. Blake, ever the hothead, was furious, seeing Amaryllis as a public insult. But Mason, the older and more dangerous of the two, was chillingly calm. "This isn't about buzz anymore," he said, pulling up an article about Amaryllis on a tablet. "They're hurting our bottom line. Liam is the problem. He's the soldier, the strategist. He's the engine of the company. Without him, the artist is just an artist." She floundered. He looked from his brother to his mother, his meaning clear. "We need to remove the engine." Eleanor didn't speak. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. That was all the permission they needed. The plan was as cowardly as it was cruel. An accident, untraceable, a tragedy. Liam had just spent the day finalizing a game-changing deal with a national department store, a victory that would catapult Amaryllis into the major leagues. He was driving back from the meeting late at night on a quiet, winding road just outside the city. The rain was beginning to fall. He was on the phone with CARLA, his voice electric with excitement. "We did it, CARLA. We really did it. This changes everything." Those were the last words she would ever hear him say. From her end of the line, CARLA heard his sudden, sharp intake of breath. Then the horrifying screech of tires on wet asphalt, a violent, sickening crunch of metal on metal, and then a profound, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of the falling rain. She screamed his name, over and over into the dead air. The police report called it a tragic accident, a hit and run. No witnesses, a driver who lost control. But CARLA knew, in the deepest, coldest part of her soul, She knew it was a lie. The success they had celebrated just hours before was the reason her brother was dead. Their dream had been turned into a weapon against them. As she stood in the sterile white morgue, looking at the only person who had ever truly protected her, something inside her didn't just break. It calcified. It turned to ice. The soft petals of the amaryllis bloom had been violently ripped away, and in their place, thorns were beginning to grow. That night, she returned to the silent studio, the air thick with her brother's absence. She found an old photo of her mother, smiling gently, and remembered her soft words from long ago. No matter what, live like a flower. Carla looked at the photo for a long moment, then carefully placed it face down in a drawer. Flowers were beautiful, she thought, but they were fragile. They could be picked, crushed underfoot. The world had taught her that. From now on, she would not be the flower. She would be the thorns that protect the garden. The next morning, her transformation began. The executives from the department store called to offer their condolences, expecting to hear that the amaryllis deal was off. They assumed the artist would be lost without the businessman. Instead, Carla summoned them to a meeting. She walked in, not as a grieving sister, but as a CEO. Her voice was steady, her eyes were ice. She didn't just confirm their deal. She laid out a new, aggressive 3-point expansion plan so brilliant it left them speechless. They had come to console a victim. They left as soldiers in her new army. Her next move was silent. She used the first advance from the deal not to hire more designers, but to hire the best private investigator money could buy. A discreet, ruthless man who specialized in digging up the buried secrets of the rich. His first task, find everything about Mason and Blake's movements on the night of the accident. Every call, every transaction, every alibi. The war had begun. Eleanor, Mason, and Blake thought they had extinguished a threat. They had no idea they had just armed their enemy. Carla Davenport, the runaway, was gone. The brilliant artist was a ghost. In her place sat a queen, building a throne of silence and strategy, waiting for her moment to strike. They had meant to kill a dream. Instead, they had created their own personal nightmare. Carla's attacks were surgical and relentless. She poached Davenport's head of textiles with an offer so good it was impossible to refuse. She launched a revolutionary line of sustainable luxury wear that made the Davenport collection look dated and irresponsible overnight. Her marketing campaigns were masterpieces of subtle warfare, never mentioning her rival by name, but positioning Amaryllis as the future and everything else as the past. Inside the glass tower of Davenport Industries, panic had become a fever. Mason and Blake were constantly at each other's throats, blaming their staff, the market, each other, everyone but themselves. Eleanor watched the empire she had stolen begin to crumble, her famous composure finally cracking under the strain of Carla's invisible siege. Then, one evening, the private investigator delivered the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a confession. It was colder, better financial records. A shell corporation, traceable to Mason, had made a $50,000 payment to a disgraced mechanic, a specialist in untraceable vehicle. Modifications 2 days after Liam's death. The memo on the payment read simply, disposal fee. It was the nail for the coffin. With the evidence in hand, Carla launched her final assault. As Davenport's stock price plummeted, shell companies, all secretly funded by Amaryllis's massive profits, began buying. Quietly, patiently, share by share, Carla was purchasing her father's company out from under his betrayers. When her secret holdings reached 51%, she made her move. An email was sent from an anonymous holding firm demanding an emergency board meeting to address the company's catastrophic failure. The agenda: the hostile takeover of Davenport Industries. Eleanor, Mason, and Blake had no choice but to attend. Their last desperate hope was to appeal to the board's new, mysterious majority shareholder. They walked into the boardroom preparing for a business fight. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. The Queen was about to reveal herself, and she was coming to collect a debt written in blood. The heavy doors at the far end of the room swung open, and she walked in. It wasn't the runaway girl. It wasn't the grieving artist. It was CARLA, the CEO of Heiress, dressed in a black suit of her own design that was sharper than a shard of glass. Power radiated from her. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Mason and Blake stared, their mouths agape, their arrogance dissolving into pure, stunned disbelief. CARLA didn't acknowledge them. She walked to the head of the table, placing her tablet down. "The meeting will come to order," she said, her voice clear and cold, echoing in the dead silence. "As the new majority shareholder of this company, my first action is to call a vote." She looked at the other board members, her eyes locking with each of them. "All those in favor of terminating the employment and severing all ties with Eleanor, Mason, and Blake Davenport, effective immediately." Hands went up around the table. It was unanimous. "You're fired," CARLA said, looking directly at the three of them. Mason finally found his voice, sputtering with rage. But CARLA cut him off, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This isn't about your incompetence. This is about a debt. You took my home. You watched my mother fade away from a broken heart. And you murdered my brother." A collective gasp went through the room. "You called it a tragic accident," she continued, pressing a button on her tablet. The large presentation screen behind her lit up. "I call it a $50,000 payment to a man who specializes in making inconvenient things and people disappear." The bank records flashed onto the screen for all to see. The Shell Corporation, the wire transfer, the damning memo, disposal fee. "You thought you were removing an engine?" CARLA said, her voice trembling with a year of suppressed fury. "You were signing your own confession." As Eleanor stared at the screen, her mask of cold composure finally shattering into 1,000 pieces, the boardroom doors opened one last time. It wasn't a board member. It was 2 police detectives, Eleanor, Mason, and Blake Davenport. The lead detective said, his voice calm and official. "You are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed in the silent, cavernous room. As they were led away past the board, past the empire they had stolen and destroyed, CARLA stood perfectly still, watching them go. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel triumph. She felt only a profound, chilling emptiness. The war was over. The debt was paid. Justice served ice cold. Asterisk revenge had been a fire that kept her warm in the coldest year of her life. But now that it was extinguished, she was left with only the ashes. The emptiness was a canyon inside her. Liam was still gone. Her mother was still a memory. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the small, gritty studio where Amaryllis was born. There, in the back of a drawer, she found the old photo of her mother she had hidden away. She looked at the gentle, smiling face, and the words came back to her, not as a memory, but as a quiet plea. Live like a flower, and for the first time since Liam's death, CARLA wept. Not tears of rage, but of release. She had been the thorns for so long. She had forgotten the entire purpose of thorns is to protect something beautiful. She knew then that her war was not truly over. There was one final battle, the battle for her own soul. Honoring Liam wasn't about punishing his killers. It was about continuing the dream they had built together. Honoring her mother wasn't about being hard. It was about finding the strength and resilience and softness. The transformation of her empire began. She didn't just run Davenport Industries. She remade it, merging its powerful legacy with the fearless, innovative spirit of Amaryllis. She launched the Liam Davenport Foundation, a multi-million-dollar fund to give young, underprivileged designers the chance they never had. She turned a company built on secrets into a beacon of opportunity. Her next collection for Amaryllis was her most anticipated. The world expected more of the dark, architectural armor that had defined her revenge. Instead, what they saw was light. Soft fabrics, flowing lines, and intricate floral embroidery. It was a collection inspired by memory, resilience, and hope. She called it simply Bloom. It was not the work of a warrior queen, but of an artist who is finally healing. Our story ends not in a boardroom, but in a small sunlit garden she had built on the rooftop of the Davenport Tower. Carla is sketching in her notebook, a genuine, quiet smile on her face as she looks out over the city. The ghosts are finally silent. The war is over. She survived the fire, and she survived the ice. And now, in the warm light of a new day, Carla Davenport was, at last, choosing to bloom.